Welcome to CNRL Author Talks, where authors come to talk about their latest books with librarians from the Central Northern Regional Library in New South Wales, Australia. This week, Narrabri Library Coordinator Naomi Radford introduces author Vivienne Freestone as she discusses her first novel, Discovering Matthew.
Good morning everyone and welcome. I'd like to give a sincere welcome to Vivienne and David. They are travelling around Australia on a long trip promoting Vivienne's new book, Discovering Matthew. And yes, I'd like to welcome you to Narrabri. And so I'll let you get on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Naomi. Welcome everyone. As Naomi said, I'm Viv and this is David. We live in South Australia, and I'm just going to start off by telling you a little bit about our story, or my story, and how the book came about. And then David's going to ask me some questions, so it's not just me talking, because that's really boring. You'll get used to my voice, but hopefully you'll learn a little bit more as well. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for you to ask questions, and we can have a chat about any individual issues that you would like to bring up. All right, well, I'll get into this. So I'm a wife, a mum, a nana, and I've got over 40 years of experience in my initial field, which is speech pathology. So I trained as a speech pathologist in the mid-70s in the first speech path course that was ever run in Adelaide. And because I'm so old, I've had a lot of years of watching developments in this field. Around the turn of the century, I did a master's in special ed because I was working a lot in schools, and I decided to try and understand them a bit better and understand teachers a bit better. So I became a teacher, and I worked as a teacher as well in an autism-specific unit in Pambula in New South Wales, which is down south of Bega on the coast, down there somewhere. So we spent probably nearly 40 years on the far south coast of New South Wales. I moved over from South Australia, and we also spent some time in Queensland. I ran an autism service in Cairns, and I've also worked in the ACT, and of course now back in South Australia. And I'm currently working in another remote area, Kangaroo Island. So I travel over there from where we live, and I do a week on, week off sort of thing. So I've done, the great majority of my working life has been in rural and remote areas. So I really do understand little towns and the pressures of trying to get a diagnosis and getting therapy. And often I've been the only person available. And somewhere along that line, I made a momentous decision that I would try and be an expert in something, and what I chose was autism. And I would say right there that I'm still not an expert in autism. And we were talking earlier about having lived experiences, and that's where I've learnt the most, is reading books by people who are on the spectrum or people that care for people on the spectrum, talking with people on the spectrum, and then watching how things work for them. And as I said before, being so old, I've had decades of being able to watch the progression of people as they've gone through life, and at different stages had different challenges. So yes, that's the sort of a nutshell, and I might hand over to David and he can ask me some questions, because I always just burble on and he's very good at getting me back on track.
Thank you. One thing you mentioned that you're currently working on Kangaroo Island. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about how you do that therapy, what it involves you doing?
So Kangaroo Island, as you may or may not know, is offshore. So it's more than 5 kilometres offshore, which makes it one of the most remote areas under the NDIS funding categories. So I travel 45 minutes, wait for a ferry, hop on a ferry for 45 minutes, and then travel another 45 minutes when I get there. So it's a big commitment of time and energy, but the reason that I've done that is that I went back to work for Autism SA briefly when I first went back to Adelaide, and I did establish a service in the southern end of the Fleurieu Peninsula, which included Kangaroo Island. And talking to families out there, what I realised is exactly what you were just saying, Anita, that getting a diagnosis is very problematic. Getting therapy regularly is very problematic. So I made a commitment to do that. And I enjoy going over there. I've got about 25 families that I see when I go over there, and that would not be all of the people that need support, but that's as many as I can see.
How many families would you see over there?
25. Is on my
And you take all your resources in your car?
So I have a little car, and I pack it all up, and I take my sensory resources and my speech and language resources and my social skills resources, and I toddle off. Yep.
But it's interesting, while we've been away, a lot of these families on Kangaroo Island are the ones that are constantly emailing, ringing, seeking support. And if therapists like Viv weren't going to these remote areas, these families would be left pretty much on their own, homeschooling on their own, and things like that. Do you have any experience with families that are homeschooling?
Yeah, it's not an uncommon thing, especially with children on the spectrum. So most of my clients on KI do have an autism spectrum disorder. So I don't just deal with that, but most of them do have that. And of that, a number of them are being homeschooled. It's not uncommon. And sadly, that's sometimes been because parents have tried the school system and it just hasn't worked for that child. So yes, it's very common. We've just been up to a place called Agnes Water in Queensland, and there's a very large group of homeschooled children there, many of whom are on the spectrum, I'm told. So yeah, it's not just where I know best, it's a lot of places.
So can you tell us why you decided to write and self-publish this book, which is technically a work of fiction?
It is.
Why did you do that?
It's really important to say that it is a work of fiction. This is not the story of a person called Matthew. It's a made-up story, but it's based on 40 years of observation, as I said before, and also so many of the things that happen in the book have happened to people that I've known. Obviously, there's poetic license or author's license in a lot of other things, but many of the incidents are real. I made the decision by the side of a trout stream in 2009. David was fishing and I was bored, so I had an exercise book and a pencil, and I thought, I'm going to just start writing this story. And obviously it had been in my head for a while, but it came out. And it took a long time to get it all finished in between all the other things that I was doing. But COVID helped. COVID actually was helpful because it focused me in on trying to get it done and edited. And then I found a lady who lives in Goolwa, which isn't far from where we live, who helps people to self-publish. So I've actually put her name to, or given her name to a number of people who've come up to me after book events and said, I've got a book I'd love to get published. So that was the choice we made. We didn't try to find a commercial publisher because I wasn't sure how well the book would be accepted, and I just wanted to get the story out there. So that's what happened.
So can you tell us what the book is about?
Yeah. Well, for a start, it's about a boy called Matthew and his family. Matthew is a boy in his last year of primary education, so he's a little bit older than your little fellow. He has a lot of sensory issues. He has a lot of social issues. His behaviour is a problem. He gets suspended from school. And his whole family is affected by that. And effectively what happens is that the family splits. Mum and the children move to a country area to start again. And then the family story goes from there. I'm not going to tell you very much more than that, other than the focus is not on Matthew's disability. The focus is on the fact that Matthew thinks differently and he has some skills and talents that are there because he has an autism spectrum disorder. So I like to say that he has a different ability, and some of that helps him to be a bit of a hero in his community. So that's why the little line you probably can't read there says, a journey of acceptance and joy in the world of autism. I know that the journey is a hard journey because I've been there with people, but I also know that people on the spectrum can do amazing things.
So where is the story set?
Set in a rural area, I've tried to be a bit vague about it, but it is near the coast because that's probably where my experience has been. The families come from a city to a rural area, but it's non-specific. I have a place in my head, but that might not be the place when you read the book that you put it. One of the most important things that people do ask me is, why is there so much autism about? And I think that what we know is that the statistics are showing that it's increasing in statistical prevalence to the point where Autism Australia says it's about 1 person in 70 in Australia, and that would put us at about 350,000 people in Australia are affected by an autism spectrum disorder directly, plus all the people that they live with. So that's a huge number when you think about it. The lowest number that I've heard is 1 in 50, which is in schools in America. That's the statistic that I've seen. So if you think about that, and sometimes it's as low as 1 in 30, that's at least 1 in every school class. So that's a huge and ongoing problem. And just before I launch into this, I will say that in South Australia, our state government, our new state government, has just made a huge commitment to putting more resources into autism in schools. And the federal government's also just announced a big funding package to try to improve resources and services and supports and outcomes in workplaces, because the stats on people with autism in workplaces are also very worrying. In fact, people with autism have much less likelihood than the general population of people with disabilities in getting and maintaining a job. And that's a whole area which I'm not going to talk about now, but you can see that this isn't just about children, it's a lifelong thing, and as your client would know. One of the things I like to say is that over time, there have been many people on the autism spectrum who at the time would not have been diagnosed, but now looking back, they had classical symptoms of autism. What would the world be like without people like these people? Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, this one's Michelangelo. We also have Mozart, we have Thomas Jefferson. Think about all the scientific and creative things that would not have happened if people didn't think differently. One of the things I really like to say about autism spectrum disorders is that they are only part of who the person is. So obviously the individual has specific characteristics, their personality, their motivation, their life experiences, and other things that might be happening in their lives. These over on the right side are the characteristics of autism, which are specifically now around sensory processing, cognitive processing, that is their thinking style, social understanding, and the behavioural aspects of that. So that diagnosis was changed in 2013. Before that, language disability was part of the diagnosis, and it's now not. It certainly can coexist, but it's now not part of the diagnosis. So if you put the person as an individual plus the features of autism together, what tends to happen is there is a mismatch with their environment, and that results in unusual and challenging behaviours, issues with emotional regulation, learning difficulties, and issues with relationships. So it's a whole of life thing. This slide is all about obsessions. So what we know about people with autism is that they have very fixed interests in things, and they're very interested in things that perhaps other people aren't so interested in. So you can see Thomas the Tank Engine and Star Wars and Pokemon, things that children love, but they love them for a short time and then they move on to something else. With autism, we know that those obsessions might be lifelong. For example, there's a young man that I used to work with who is now 18 and a school captain in his high school, and he's obsessed with the Wiggles, which for an 18-year-old is very inappropriate, But he loves them. So his mum still takes him along, and he has played on stage with the Wiggles because they've got to know him over the years. And he's a very functional young man. He's just got his driver's licence. He will go into the workforce in some capacity, but his obsession is still the Wiggles. So you can see that some of those things are, if you like, normal things for people to be interested in, but things like green rubbish bins are not. And that one particularly created a problem for the person that was obsessed with that, because on bin day he had to go to school in a certain way so that he could see the maximum number of rubbish bins. And if his mum didn't remember that and took him a different way, he got very, very upset. And I'm sure that if you know someone with autism, you would definitely be aware of their particular obsessions. I'm going to quickly move on to the sensory things. I just want to cover these. Now, we all know that there are 5 basic senses that we've all been familiar with, but I also want to say that there are some more senses: proprioception, the vestibular sense, and interoception, which is the internal sense. So proprioception and the vestibular sense are to do with movement and place in space, and interoception is how we feel inside. So I might be feeling hungry, or I might be uncomfortable, and knowing what all those senses are and where they come from, which bit of the body is involved, is really important in being able to be regulated, sensorily regulated. So the occupational therapists in the world work a lot on this area, but it's something that we all need to understand if we're going to understand autism. Now, I quickly want to put you in the place of a person with autism. This picture was drawn by a little girl in a class in a school, and it's called The Day the Can of Pepsi Exploded. Please try and ignore all the other words because there's a few rude ones there. But has anybody got any comment to make about that picture?
Is that what's going on in her head?
It's certainly what's going on in her head, and it's what's going on around her. But has she been able to observe just the things that are interesting to her, or has she gone with everything?
It's an amazing picture.
It's amazing, isn't it? So you think about if she's in a classroom, if I was in that classroom and a can of Pepsi exploded, I would be aware of the teacher trying to mop it up, or the teacher's frustration saying, get back, I've got, those kinds of basic things. I might be sitting in my desk laughing at it or whatever. But she's observed every single thing, everything people have said, everything that was going on, and she's drawn it. That's a pretty amazing skill. I couldn't do that. But it also shows you the level of input that people are dealing with. As you can imagine, if she couldn't ignore all those sensory things, she's going to look more like this guy than like the person who's chilled out and coping.
Would you call her a detail detective?
I would call her a detail detective, David. And one of the wonderful things about Matthew is he's a detail detective as well. So let's see if we can be detail detectives. I'm now showing a picture of, well, what is it of? Can anyone tell me? What can you see there? Because you might see different things to what I see.
I'm trying to see what's inside the ear. I see a woman and a man.
A woman and a man, a face and an ear.
Oh, it's a lady. Yes. Oh.
What do you see this as? Could it also be someone's hand? If this is his face and his nose and his hand.
Oh.
This is his collar and that's his ear. But that's also a lady with a baby. Yeah, and that's an old bloke with a hat on. Are there any other faces? Can you see any other faces? So that's what's called seeing the forest from the trees. So people on the spectrum tend to see detail. And as David said, we often call them detail detectives. They see very fine details. Now, just because you saw the little details doesn't mean you're on the spectrum, but it is something that they're very good at doing. But they find it very hard to combine those details into a whole picture. So seeing that whole picture of the gentleman and all those little parts of him blended together is very difficult. Okay, I'm also going to show you some of the language issues around autism, just quickly. Ducks, but so's this. That says, out for a duck, you'd better duck, I'm just going to duck out. How complicated is our language when one word can actually bring to mind all those different pictures? So as I was saying before, in the book, what I realised was that I was using a lot of figurative language. It's just something that is in conversation. And I've read books that have been written by people, including a lovely book called It's Raining Cats and Dogs, written by a man called Michael Barton, who's on the spectrum. And he talks a lot about how hard it is for him to understand. He understands literally. So it's the old idea of it's raining cats and dogs, you look outside for the cats and dogs falling out of the sky. I know that's a silly example, but that's the one that he went with. But a lot of our language has two meanings. For example, I think the boss is over the hill, and just over the hump of the hill, I heard that. Okay, so if you can imagine that your sensory system is really mixed up and disordered, your language you're trying to understand and you find that really hard to do, so your communication falls apart, and that all leads to your behaviour falling down. Obviously the level of stress is high, and a lot of our littlies look like that guy a lot of the time. Okay, so in our modern world, there are some more people that we know who have been diagnosed on the spectrum. So Jerry Seinfeld, the actor and comedian, this guy's name is Satoshi Tajiri, and he's the creator of Pokemon. And he's actually come out quite recently as a very strong advocate for people on the spectrum. Interestingly, his creation is adored by people on the spectrum. We also know that Woody Allen and Steven Spielberg are on the spectrum. We have a whole range of other creative people there. So imagine the world without all their creativity. Dan Aykroyd, Anthony Hopkins, Courtney Love, Daryl Hannah, Stanley Kubrick and Andy Warhol, to name a few.
Is creativity aligned with autism? Is that
I think what's aligned with it is a way of thinking differently.
right?
So seeing the world differently, but also it's interesting you ask that, because there's a lady called Wendy Lawson who's an Australian woman with autism who's written a lot of books. I've read a couple of hers, and she describes the experience of seeing colours in a shaft of light, like being able to see that shaft of light has colours and movement. So their sensory experiences are often quite different to what neurotypical people see and describe. So I think you're right. I think that comes to creativity.
Then unleash creativity.
Yeah, I think that's right, if they're in the right environment for that to be allowed to happen.
Right.
So again, some more creative people. Susan Boyle, Elon Musk, I'm not sure how creative he is. He's interesting. Bill Gates, who we know has done amazing things. We were all aware of Greta Thunberg recently. And Temple Grandin, who, if you ever want to read more on autism, I will go to her website. She's a very interesting woman, American woman, who you may have heard of. She didn't speak till I think she was 6 or 7. She had a lot of speech pathology as a young person. She was also the person who first led us towards knowing about deep pressure being helpful for people on the spectrum, and she invented a thing called the squeeze machine, which was, the original version was basically 2 pieces of wood that she lay between, and she pulled it down onto herself with some sort of mechanism to give herself a calming experience. And we now know that weight and pressure is really, really good for people on the spectrum to help them to calm. So Temple Grandin has some amazing skills in drawing, and she has also described how animals panic and feel stress, because she does too. And that has led her to a career of being able to design pens and yards for animals which are going to slaughter, so that she designs them so they go calmly, and the meat is very different apparently. So I know that sounds macabre, but what an amazing skill to be able to do that. She's an international spokesperson. They've also made a movie about her life starring Claire Danes, which I would recommend. It's actually really, really well done.
Is autism genetic?
Yes, it can be. It's a high possibility of autism in the next generation. So you'll notice in Matthew's story that we do talk a little bit about that. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to quickly finish off these slides and then we can open for questions. This is some Australians who live with autism. So we all know we know of Barry Humphries, Julian Assange, who is, I think, still somewhere incarcerated, Hannah Gadsby, who's a fairly recently arrived comedian, and this guy from the Vines. If you Google it, there's lots of other examples, and I could have gone on forever. And Waleed Ali's son is diagnosed, and he's becoming quite vocal about working with children with autism. So I like to say that while autism can coexist with other conditions like an intellectual disability or a physical disability, and that creates a whole set of issues, autism in and of itself can actually be a superpower. And I hope that in the story of Matthew, I've been able to address that a little bit, because I believe that without people with a different way of thinking, our world would be a much lesser place. So I would love to see more acceptance and more understanding and moving forward so that people with autism are just part of the mainstream rather than being different. So that's the story of the book, and I hope you've got something out of the information that I've been able to bring.
Well, you've told us a lot of information.
I have.
Can you tell us how Discovering Matthew can be read and enjoyed by someone that's perhaps not directly involved in the medical professions or understands jargon at all?
Yeah, well, I suppose what that makes me think about, Dave, is we've had a few reviews which we've got copies of there from people that have read it, from lawyers, accountants, nurses, a whole range of people who have said, teachers, that they had wished they had had that book when they were working more in communities, or they're going to use it to be able to think very differently about their client base. It's not meant to be a textbook. It's meant to be easy to read, and it's meant to be accessible to a wide variety of people, because that's what I want. I want people to hear the story and understand more about autism, not because they're getting facts about autism per se, but they're reading a story that's accessible. It's pretty easy to read. It's not terribly long, and it will have a sequel. And there will be a female character in the sequel, because I've been asked to do that. However, the reviews seem to be telling me that is happening, which is great.
So for example, if an autistic child has been lost in the bush or in the desert, would a state emergency services worker, for example, who have read this book, be in a better place to find that child?
I hope so. We all know that there have been some incidents over recent years where SES personnel have had to use whatever's been recommended by parents generally to try and find someone. And there was one in Victoria, I think fairly recently, where they played Thomas the Tank Engine music for that boy, because they knew he wouldn't come to a stranger, even if they were a metre away from him, unless he felt comfortable, and that was his obsession, and that's what made him feel comfortable, and that had a really positive outcome. So, yeah, I would love to see the book, not from my perspective, but from that kind of perspective, go out and about so people's understanding could increase. Yeah.
One of the book launches we had done at Strathalbyn, we had the federal member of Parliament come and visit. She was Rebecca Sharkey, and she's an independent member, and she'd just been recently re-elected, so she's still in Canberra. And she had read the book, and the thing that she made a comment on was that she wished the Prime Minister at that time, Prime Minister Morrison, had also read the book, because he wouldn't have perhaps made the comment that he was blessed not to have a child with a disability. And she was very passionate about the book, and she actually quoted a couple of passages from the book that had an impact on her. And if people such as her can read the book and feel so passionately aware of autism, they will be in a better place to make decisions about autism policy and families who are dealing with it on a daily basis.
Well, I think the main goal is to be able to express to the wider world, the neurotypical world in particular, what the impact of an autism spectrum disorder can be, not just on the person, but on the family and the community. And certainly in the sequel I'm currently writing, I'm trying to express that further and use a female perspective as well, because it's about Matthew and his friend Maisie, who are going into high school, and high school can be very problematic for these kids and their families. As I said before, it's a lifelong issue, and we need to be, as a community, accepting people on the autism spectrum who may have differences in the way that they function, but without whom we'd be a lesser world.
So finally, I just would like to talk about the cover. Why did you choose such a colourful cover with so many things going on?
Well, I thought about creating a cover for quite some time, and I'm not all that artistic. So if I draw social stories, they have stick people, and it's pretty limited. However, you can get amazing things online. And when the person that was helping us self-publish showed me where to go, I found this image, which she has changed slightly. So we bought the image and then she changed it slightly to reflect some of the things in Matthew, in Discovering Matthew. And the reason that I liked it was there's a strategy that I've used for decades called Pictures of Me, and it's a strategy to explain the diagnosis once the person has the diagnosis. And what it involves is getting all the people that are close to the person to draw a picture of them. And it might just be a picture of what they're good at, or might be a picture of them as a person with things that they're good at. It doesn't even have to be a great picture, and mine are not, as I said, they're stick figures. But one particular person that drew a Pictures of Me page did exactly this. The person's head and all the things that they were good at floating around. And when I saw this, I knew that this was the right cover for the book, because it's exactly what we want to see, is their strengths, the things they're great at, the things that they're gifted in. Yes, they still have issues, and we talk about that in that strategy of explaining their diagnosis, but we also focus on the things that they're great at. And Matthew is particularly great at a few of those things.
So I noticed there's a picture of a horse
There is.
on the cover above Matthew's head, presumably. Are there any horses
There are.
Discovering that?
There are horses.
And if Hugh Grant was here looking across a crowded room with Julia Roberts in Notting Hill, he'd probably ask, are there any hounds in his...
Sadly, there are no hounds. There are no hounds.
So no, and perhaps in the sequel?
Perhaps there will be.
Oh, excellent. Readers of Horse and Hound will be most pleased.
Thank you, David. That's David's little joke. So
That's all right.
he did well.
So we'll probably
We're going to stop talking.
stop talking. We could ask whether it's a book for a book club, perhaps, to look at.
Yeah.
Is that something that you...
Look, it would be wonderful if any group of people got together to discuss it. I haven't, excuse me, I haven't put questions in the back of it, but everyone will have their own questions. So I'd love it if book clubs read it, and I'd love to get feedback about it.
And for the feedback, how do they give you the feedback? Is there an email address? Or...
It's freestone8@bigpond.com. And I also have a Facebook site that's just for Discovering Matthew, which is Viv, Freestone.
I've just got a question. I've been interested in the colour or the tone of the pages in the book and the font.
Oh, thank you for noticing. That's quite a deliberate choice. I was given the choice, and I chose a page colour, and I can't remember what colour it is, but it's an easier to access colour and an easier to access font.
So not glary colour.
Yeah, it's not a bright white page that jumps at you. It's not a specific font that they call a dyslexia font, but it's an easier to read one.
I found it extremely
Good.
flowing and easy.
Good. Yeah. No, that was a deliberate choice that I made when we made those choices, because obviously people on the spectrum themselves do have some learning issues, and I do work a lot with children with reading problems. It's not necessarily a thing, and in fact many people on the spectrum are hyperlexic and read really, really well. Not necessarily always with comprehension, but yeah, they can read. So yes, those things were in my mind, which takes me back to my basic training as a speech pathologist. So, yeah, thank you for noticing. I really appreciate that.
Is autism more prominent in one sex over the other?
Yes, it is.
What, in males?
I think it used to be 1 to 4, and I think we're now diagnosing girls more frequently and more accurately. So I think it might be 1 to 6 now. Depends on what you read, but definitely more boys than girls. Sorry, that might be the wrong way around. 1 to 6 was 6 boys to 1 girl, and now it's 4 boys to 1 girl. There's various schools of thought about that, and one is that with girls, because they tend to be more capable with language and social skills, they mask a lot of the issues with autism. So there's a lot of things being written, and Temple Grandin has written on this, and also Tony Attwood's put out a book called, it's now been retitled Autism and Girls. It was called Asperger's and Girls, but they've retitled it. It's in the library system, I'm sure. Anyway, Tony Attwood is a very famous Australian psychologist from Brisbane and has worked with autism and Asperger's for years and years. Anyway, so I think the theory is that girls can tend to mask the symptoms, and if they do get diagnosed, it's much later than boys, because the boys have more of the behavioural issues, the meltdowns, and previous to 2013, a lot of the language disability, which was part of the diagnosis. So it might be evening up, but it's still boys more than girls. Yeah. All right, well, we might finish off and let you lovely people go your way. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate your attendance. Good.
I found your talk really interesting.
Oh, thank you. Nan.
Yeah, and helpful to us in the workplace here in libraries, public libraries. Yeah.
My pleasure. When the sequel, if it ever happens, comes out, I'll let you know. And because at each place I've gone, the libraries have said, "Oh, you must come back and do the sequel." So we'll definitely let you know.
Yep. Let me know.
Matthew and Maisie continue.
Yeah, Matthew and Maisie. What a
Yeah.
nice couple of years.
Thank you.
For more CNRL Author Talks and other podcasts, visit our website at cnl.nsw.gov.au or follow your CNRL branch Facebook page. This podcast was recorded at Narrabri Library, with music by Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear, from the freemusicarchive.org. I'm Jonathan Stilts from the CNRL Library Innovation Studio. See you next time for more CNRL Author Talks.